Labas, shalom, hello. I am Kristen Hazel, the Director of Development at the Vilna Shul, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program. Before we begin, I would like to thank our fiscal sponsors, the Institute for Jewish Studies and Interfaith Understanding at Old Dominion University and the Virginia Holocaust Museum. Built in 1919 by immigrants from Vilnius, the Vilna is the only Jewish historic landmark remaining in downtown Boston. Our recent $4 million renovation honors the historic nature of the building while propelling the Vilna into the 21st century and allowing us to serve our community in new and exciting ways. We look forward to hearing from today's speakers about how they use science to humanize history. The Vilna congregation, which began in 1893, was a shul, a spiritual place of worship, but it was also the center for Jewish life and tangible support to these Jewish immigrants of Boston. Now, over 100 years later, think of us as a JCC or 92nd Street Y on Beacon Hill, a central hub of activity, all the while brimming with history. If you enjoyed today's program, we have another program with Richard Freund coming up on April 11th called Tales from the Lagoon, directed by a Lithuanian woman named Ruta Vaizintat. It's about the team's quest to find the village in the lagoon and the mass grave on land of the Jews of Rumshishuk in central Lithuania. The registration link is in the chat. A few logistics about today's program. Smithsonian writer Matthew Scher will interview scientists Richard Freund, Phil Reeder, and Harry Joel. You will also see on your screen filmmaker Susan Cardillo and Kyle Conti. Instead of introducing each panelist, their bios would be pasted into the Zoom chat box momentarily. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes, and we will leave the last 25 to 30 minutes for audience Q&A. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. If you didn't already watch the film, the link will be pasted into the chat box too. The film will be available after the discussion, and we highly encourage you to watch it. And now I am pleased to introduce Matthew Scher. Matt wrote an amazing piece on Matilda Olkin for the Smithsonian. Matt, would you start by letting us know how you met this team and why you thought this story was worth researching and writing?
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much, Kristen, for having me. I'd be remiss if I didn't say my whole family's from Boston. My grandmother, whose parents immigrated from Lithuania, grew up in Brookline, so it feels really special to be able to talk here tonight. I was looking back through old emails to look at the genesis of how I got involved in this story, and the short answer is that I'd worked with Richard and his colleagues. They'd done an excavation, or not an excavation, but a kind of digital exploration or search for an escape tunnel out of a Nazi death camp in Lithuania, and I'd gone for the Smithsonian to write about that. That was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And after I got back, wrote the story came out. I got another email from Richard, and he said, I've got a new story for you. It's extraordinary. And usually, I hope Richard won't mind me saying this, when someone approaches a journalist, you've already written about them once, do you want to go back and write about them again? But the story that Richard presented to me in this first email was pretty irresistible. The way that he framed it for me, and it's the story that I eventually wrote, was about a young woman named Matilda Olkin, who in the years leading up to World War II wrote a number of extraordinary poems. She became famous or quasi-famous regionally in her lifetime for her poetry. She was Jewish, and a lot of her poems are not explicitly about Judaism, but it's clear that she's writing from a very specific perspective. She was killed. She and her family were killed by Nazi collaborators in Lithuania. And when Richard wrote, Matilda's reputation or name was in the midst of kind of being resurrected in Lithuania. There was a really popular play that had been produced about her life. There were plans to publish some of her poetry on a broader scale than it had been before. And Richard had become involved because he had been asked by Lithuanians in this northeastern Lithuanian village where Matilda had come from, to help them find out exactly where Matilda had died and been buried, where her family had died and been buried. And so his pitch to me was, come out with us when we go out to look for Matilda, and at the same time you'll get a chance to talk to some people who are alive who had contact with her. You'll get to meet all sorts of amazing people in Lithuania who have been working so hard to bring her story to light. And so I went, and I think this is true of the first story that I wrote about Richard's work. What appealed to me so much about this and what made it so special is it's really easy for the Holocaust to become abstract in the sense of an abstract amount of awful suffering, and to get to think only about numbers. And it seems to me, and as a reader myself, that the stories that I respond most to are the stories about people, and the more specific, the better. And when you do feel like you can understand even a little bit what one person went through, it brings the whole tragedy, I don't know, for me, it brings it into a sharper focus. And so that's what I set out to do in this article. And what Richard and his team were doing as well, which is to honor this person's life, and in the process try to make some sort of sense of what happened. I am going to, in these next few minutes, I'll introduce the other members of Richard's team, and we'll be able to ask them questions. I'll be able to ask them questions, and then you'll be able to ask them questions. And I think we're going to start first because with Kyle. And Kyle, can you turn on? Let me see if I can see you. Oh yes, Lynn is also reminding me that at the to type in the questions for the Q&A. All right, there you are, Kyle. Now I can see you. All right, so Kyle, you were a member of a team while Richard and his team were doing the work of helping to find the grave. You were part of a team of undergraduates who were documenting the search and were recording your own impressions. And I'm curious, maybe you can speak a little bit about this. It's you were all young to be doing this. The final product is incredibly powerful, but what did it feel like to be in Lithuania? What did it feel like to be on this search? And what was the process of making the movie like?
So I'd like to thank everyone for having me on this. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. So originally I'm from the University of Hartford, and I'm still there now going for my master's. And so I started taking a class called Historical Video Production with Susan Cardillo. And we made this 40-minute documentary on a local women's rights activist. And we were able to go against class, and our project won, and then it kind of snowballed from there. And Susan knew Dr. Freund, which he saw my documentary, really enjoyed it, said, hey, this is really good. We'd like to have you on this project. And me, I've never been out of the country before, so this was a whole brand new experience. And Matilda's story was so eye-opening, and me being a college student and her being a college student, it really kind of hit home. And us being all students, we were able to kind of connect with her and be there in like that moment of struggle. And I thought it was a really powerful story. And the editing process was totally different. I've never done documentary filmmaking before this, just from that class. And I kind of had to learn through the process and work with the scientists that are here. And it was just a really amazing experience, but also really heartfelt and deep.
Thanks so much, Kyle. So I'm going to bring in Phil now. Phil, can you turn on your camera so we can see you? There you are. So When you're setting out to do this, this was not the first time that you'd worked with Richard, so you guys had a working relationship already. But where do you start with a project like this? What goes into the planning, and how do you execute it?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, we've been working together so many years that we've sort of developed our modus operandi for how we work together as a research team. And a lot of it comes with background research, and Richard's excellent at that. And he brings in other historians, archaeologists, et cetera, that do the background research. And then we all really have our part in the project, and sort of accentuates what we do well. And what I do well is cartography and spatial analysis. So I want to just in a few minutes kind of walk you through some of the steps that I went through in terms of sort of grounding this project in science, but yet uncovering history at the same time. So we all know we're talking about Matilda Olkin, and here's Matilda at various times in her life. And I've had the pleasure of working with our research group at many places around the world, especially in Israel and then in Lithuania. And for about the last 10 years doing research specifically related to the Holocaust. So these are some of the different places that we've worked at in Lithuania. And the area that we're talking about today is Pamudalas, which is in northeastern Lithuania near Rokiskis. And two really important benchmarks as part of this study are this barn pictured here on the left, because that's where the Olkin and Jaffe families were held by the Nazi sympathizers before they were eventually taken a few kilometers away and murdered. And then in the background, you can see the church, also on the right-hand side. And the church is where a priest from that church hid the diary and the poetry of Matilda Olkin. So a lot of projects have really, really humble beginnings. And this is a memory map. And this is a memory map of the Olkin gravesite, which was published in a newspaper as part of an interview in the 1990s. And from this memory map, we were able to sort of reconstruct where the Olkin-Jaffe gravesite potentially might be. And if I look at this map as a cartographer, I say, you know, obviously it wasn't drawn by a cartographer. The feature in the middle makes it look like there's a small valley there. And then what it is saying that 70 meters from the road is the Olkin-Jaffe burial site, which is right there. But then again, you have to keep in mind that this is a memory map. So what I do is I look for all of the available different types of map products and aerial images that I can find for a particular location. So what I've created here is an overlay, and this overlay has that memory map over top of a 1944 Luftwaffe air photograph, and then just peeking out on the right-hand side is a modern Google Earth image. So what I'm going to do is kind of deconstruct this for you. What I've done is put a couple of benchmarks onto the memory map of the distance from the road, the Olkin-Jaffe burial site, and then just the edge of that feature that's drawn on the memory map. And then if I kind of fade the memory map out and still leave those benchmark features there, you can now see the 1944 Luftwaffe photograph underneath. And this is 70 meters from the road in 1944. It's also 70 meters from the modern road, although the modern road takes a little bit of a different track. And then here's the Olkin-Jaffe burial site. But then one of the things that we noticed, and you see this arrow is pointing at an anomalous feature there in the 1944 air photograph. If you look around the air photograph, also on the left-hand side, there's another anomalous feature there. And quite honestly, I can tell you, we don't know what that is, but this anomalous feature is in the same place as the Olkin-Jaffe burial site. And then we put the benchmarks back on and then remove the 1944 map. So here's the modern day map. And as I said, the road takes a different path now, but they do intersect right at the same location, where if you go 70 yards from the road, you would expect to find, according to that memory map, the Olkin-Jaffe burial site. What we did is we measured out 65 meters to 75 meters. And then as Harry will talk about, this area was then cleared out by some local workers, which were very helpful, then to allow us to get our equipment in there and start to collect data. So as part of the research too, I'm using a very unique map product from a company that's called ESRI, E-S-R-I. And what's depicted here in the upper right-hand corner is a map of Lithuania. Anything that is in that red color is where a 1944 Luftwaffe air photograph exists. And what this map product allows you to do is to slide back and forth between a modern air photo and a 1944 air photo. Now, this is a static image, but in the real actual program, you could pull this line across and it would show the 1944 Luftwaffe photograph, or you could pull it back and it would show the modern air satellite image. So here it is down here then. This is the 1944 Luftwaffe air photograph. Here is the village and here is the barn where the Olkin families were kept. And then this is the path they took past the church, then to their eventual murder site. And then if we zoom in on that, again, here's the barn where they were held. Here's the church that they passed by. And this is where her diary and poetry was hidden by the church priest. And then here is the path that they took to their eventual murder site. So one of the things that I do as part of the project is try to pull all kinds of information together. And it's not just me, it's a group, it's a team, a lot of which are students. So this is a student who's helping me on the left-hand side doing survey, on the right-hand side, they're doing ground penetrating radar. And then I try to pull that into diagrams and maps that then are meaningful to people besides scientists. So what's depicted here is the 2017 air photograph beside the 1944 air photograph. And then here is that anomalous feature in the lower right-hand corner where the Olkin burial site is. And then pointing to the anomalous feature that we don't know what it is. And then this is the ground penetrating radar image. So then just another depiction of that. The farmhouses that were there at this time are no longer there. What the newspaper article where the memory map came from said that a little girl saw the murder site and saw the murder take place when she was a very small girl hiding behind a bale of hay. And then that's what allowed her later in life to be able to reconstruct that memory map. So then once we kind of hone in on the location, use all these different tools and spatial analysis to find that location, and then that's where the geophysics come in. And that's what Harry's going to talk about.
Phil, before you move on, or before I move on to Harry, would you just explain quickly what a memory map is and where it comes from?
Sure, glad to. So a memory map is, and you find this very common in Holocaust studies, in that people are using their memories and their thoughts of what they went through and where they were to then many, many years later construct a map. I would say 99.99% of them are not map makers and have no skill related to maps. So it's basically putting it down on a piece of paper and depicting how they remember that site and remember that spot. What is sometimes good is if you have more than one person that experienced that same location and that same spot, so that you compare the different memory maps to each other. In this case, we had just that one memory map. And if you remember, Matt, you, I, and Harry, we looked at the memory map, we looked at the site where we thought the location was, and there is a monument there. And that monument, sometimes in Holocaust or other places, doesn't get placed in the right exact spot, or it might even be in the wrong location. And we originally looked at it and we said, this just doesn't match up. It doesn't make sense. And we drove around for an hour looking for other possible sites. And then we ended up back at that same location and we said, well, let's go for it. We're going to measure out the 70 meters and we're going to collect some data here and see if this is indeed the site. And that's how it worked out.
Perfect. Thank you for that explanation. Yeah. So before we go on to Harry here, I just want to clarify that there was an idea roughly of where the graves were of these two families. And it's, if you can picture it, I can picture it really vividly. If you haven't seen the movie, it's this huge field, right? But the field had potentially changed. The field didn't change shape, but potentially where the forest was had changed, where the edge of the field was. And so when these guys came in, they knew They had a rough idea because there was a monument there, as Phil says, but it was a big, there were a lot of places. It was a really big field, and that is where Harry's going to come in. And Harry's already got his camera on. He's ready to go. So the question for Harry is this. So you've got this big field, you've got a rough area in the field, and where do you start?
Thanks, Matt. Where we take off here, and this is why we're working as a team, is we're using multiple different tools. And I just want to link into Kyle and to what Phil said, is that there are a lot of students involved every year. And up in the upper left is a group of students who were involved in this project with Montas, an in-country partner that we work with. And they're the ones who are learning these processes. And just like Kyle of learning these processes, that becomes important for all of us instructors. On the bottom right is all the students and all the ones participating at that monument that we were just discussing. And that's where we had initial problems of where is this site as we go through. And so here, looking from an aerial photo, looking down, going that 70 meters in and saying roughly where this site is. I know I walked a lot of ground beforehand before placing where we were going to collect a grid for the ground penetrating radar. And here, working with some in-country partners here from the city of Oakland, clearing that site that we had all agreed to was, if there was a mass burial here, this is the most likely spot as we go through with that. And so here, this site that all of us worked on to clear up, and we put a grid on this site that we could collect both topographic data, meaning what is the changes in the surface here, as well as with ground penetrating radar data. And here we are collecting a data set. It is a rough surface. You have to remember this was a forest earlier. So we've got to navigate around some of these areas, a lot of field notes being taken, a lot of photos being taken. And ground penetrating radar itself is what we sometimes call GPR. I know a lot of people see it in some forensic films where they're looking for things. But essentially what we're doing is emitting a pulse into the ground. We're recording those echoes, and then we're building an image of the subsurface of what may be in the subsurface. And we need an idea of what we're looking for. And we're dealing with FM radio, right? The same frequency. So for example, on this grid, it's 500 megahertz. When you're listening to a radio station, it's often, 99.1 or something like that. The visible light is what you're looking at the screen with, right? That's the visible light, electromagnetic energy. We are just at another spectrum of the electromagnetic energy. So here we're collecting that grid, and we collected over a day, and then we went back and collected some more grids, another grid in the opposite direction. And this becomes part of a student project where we can put this into a 3D image. We can move this up and down, and sometimes you can gamify this, is what some students take a look at. But essentially what we are taking a look at is, if you had to bury 7 to 8 people into the ground here, what would that look like? And we're looking for disturbances in the ground. And if you take a look at that circle there, that circle is roughly, if you take the dimensions, is roughly 4 meters by 2 to 2.5 meters. So you're taking a look at about 12 feet by about 6 feet. And so here it's looking straight down on that. And then that's this rectangle, roughly circular rectangular area of low reflectance. And then we're seeing anomalies on the outside of that is that feature that this is the most probable site for that burial into the subsurface. And if we take a look at that site here, once we've done the ground penetrating radar work, we have the survivors memory map that Phil talked about. We have, this is a very sandy area, but we have sand and soil that is pushed up and around these areas. And when I meant I walked a lot around here, we were looking for depressions in this area. in the topographic images, this is a depression, roughly 4 meters by 2 meters, which are the dimensions if you were going to bury individuals. And we also have the stratigraphy or the layering in the subsurface that looks like graves or mass burials from other sites. So it's not just one piece of evidence that we're using multiple lines of evidence to come to a conclusion. And I just want to finish off here is just like Kyle said, is that one of my students here very much tied in, clicked with Matilda, and she got a tattoo, and that tattoo is related to one of Matilda's poems. And so I think we can see that goes through, and I think the more we do this, the better off we'll be, where people will get to know each other from different countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harry. All right, Richard, you're up. Time to turn on your camera so we can see you.
There we go. Let's so. And
you're almost on. I can hear you. There you are. Okay, perfect. So when you reached out to me in 2018, you had been contacted by folks in Lithuania and had cleared permissions to start this project. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Well, I should say that, we have done, this group of scientists and geoscience, and there's people that are watching from Calgary that are the other part of our science team that participates with us. We've done 60 sites worldwide already. And part of this is to do non-invasive archaeology. It's because in many cases, today, we live in these big, nice cities with big buildings on top. Can we retrieve information from below all these buildings, these areas? And that's what we've been trying to do. We're trying to change archaeology from being invasive, destructive, labor-intensive, expensive, into something where you can manage a site and a variety of sites. So I have to thank all these guys and women who come with us, because they bring this equipment that none of these universities could ever totally afford. So part of it is that we collaboratively, we can do these projects together. So whenever I'm bringing $250,000 worth of equipment to a country, I offer it to other archaeologists and other archaeological projects in the country. And it's something that I think that it's the only way we're going to ever change this invasive, destructive policy. The Holocaust is a special type of archaeology. These are victims who have already been victimized. Do we have to victimize them another time to get information about the Holocaust? It just seems so ludicrous to me. So part of this is an effort to do and collect data, to collect information on sites that are little known. But I have to say that the reason why we went to this northeast corner of Lithuania, we were working in major cities all over, is because at one of the screenings of the escape tunnel, this guy comes up to me afterwards and he says, I know you're considering other proposals. Can you please come to Rokiskis to work with the municipality? So I have to thank Philip and Aldona Shapiro, who came to me that night when we were doing the screening in Vilna and said, I know it's a small project. I know it's only one family and one extended family, but I think this is an important way to understand what happened here. And so I always look at proposals. We entertain about 20 proposals a year. We look at them, we think whether we can do anything, and if we can do something, then we try to do something during the next cycle when we're going to be in country. So in this case, this story seemed so specific. They had not only memory maps, they had interviews with the person who had seen the actual murder. We had these flyovers. We had the municipality of this small area participating. We had the major museum in that area that wanted to participate and get as much data. This kind of participation told me this is the kind of project we should be involved in. So we choose wisely. And I have to say, because nobody said it yet, tonight is January the 27th. A lot of people who wrote into me said, why are you doing it on January 27th? You should do this in April when Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day is. This is the date, January 27th, 1945, when the Soviets liberated Auschwitz. And for the international community, the United Nations 16 years ago decided this is the night that we should have an international Holocaust Remembrance commemoration. So I'll close just to tell you one thing, which, I can't tell you how exciting it is to take students out to the field to do this work. Because yes, we could do this research much quicker sometimes just by ourselves, but it is that moment of taking students. And by the way, someone should ask this. I don't know if anybody's going to ask it. Most of the students are not Jewish who come up with us to do these projects in Lithuania, in Poland, in Latvia, Belarus, Rhodes, Spain. They're not Jewish. Why are they interested in doing this? They're interested because it's interesting. And to me, there is one thing that I've learned about teaching students that are the generation X, Y, and Z. They want to see it. They want to touch it. They want to smell it. They want to see it. They want to experience it. They want to have their own understanding. And when they do that, they have a complete immersion in the idea. So for me, Kyle's film is a tremendous achievement. Tremendous achievement. He's a person who never really had studied anything about the Holocaust, had never studied geoscience, had never studied archaeology, but goes out to the field and learns it all and is able to communicate it to other generation X, Y, and Z. So part of this is finding the right people to work with. I'm happy that Matt, that you were willing to do this because, we had just done the escape tunnel before, but I said, this woman to me is like the Anne Frank of Lithuania. And if I don't say it tonight, Anne Frank, we don't know where her burial is. She died probably within weeks of when the Soviets would have liberated. She died of typhus. Her burial is not noted. So for me, as a person who teaches this material in classes, Anne Frank is iconic all over the world. And we'll never know where her burial place is. So in a small little way, I feel like by finding Matilda and giving Matilda a place where people can come and think about her poetry and think about her life, we are doing great honor to Anne Frank, that we don't know where she is. So it is trying to find these proposals, trying to find the right people. And just so these guys don't look at me and say, 25 years we've been working together. And there's not a moment that I don't feel like we haven't done something that has moved forward geoscience and archaeology. And that's good. That's very good. And then we're teaching it to students. So, okay, long answer to a short question. Sorry.
Thanks so much for that, Rich. I really appreciate it. And we're going to turn to Susan next. Hi, Susan.
Hey, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So tell us about the process from your point of view. I have two questions for you, but the first is, how do you get involved in this? Was this the first time that you'd done a documentary in this way?
Well, before I say that, I just want to thank everyone out there for today getting on and watching the film. I've gotten a bunch of wonderful comments from people, friend requests on social media and likes for the film. I'm very proud of it, and I'm very proud of my students. But with that said, yeah, we got involved in it. I was teaching a class called historical documentary. I've made many documentaries in my life, but I love to teach it. And we were asked to cover in that class 8 surviving Holocaust survivors that live in the Hartford area. And that's where we kind of started with it. And then Richard and I started talking, and he said, he introduced us to the Holocaust survivors. We have the museum, and said, we need to do this thing. And do you have any students? And I brought actually two filming students, one who's now out of graduate school, and we brought 3 other students with us as well to meet up with Harry's group. So we just all went, and as Richard said, students learn by doing, especially in the field I'm in. So to bring them out into the field and show them how it's done is a lot better than me standing in a classroom and trying to explain, if we could do this, we would do that. So it ended up being, an amazing experience for all of us to be there and to do it.
And do you think, looking at the work you've done so far and the product of all that work, do you think there's more of this story to tell?
Oh, absolutely. We were limited by time, scope, funding, all of those things. And I was there, we were there, I was there to teach something and follow the science with my scientist friends. And we would have loved to gotten more into the poetry, the diary. That should be the next steps. That should be the follow-up. I was privy to reading some of the diary that we could get translated into English, because it's all in Lithuanian. And excuse me if I've got that language wrong. I'm not sure what language she wrote in. I know there's a question about that, and I'll let an expert answer that part. But she was just a regular college kid, just trying to go to college, who had an immense talent in poetry. And then all these horrible things happen. And I think that's the next, that's the great part of the story that we were not able to get to in the scope and, like I said, funding and timing we had with it. But yes, I absolutely believe there's a lot more to the story.
I'm going to open it up to all the panelists. If you guys can all turn on your cameras here. So I want to ask you all to maybe reflect a little bit on why Matilda's story specifically matters, and why it was important to pursue this work. And I feel strongly that for me, it's a matter of finding someone who can put voice to an experience as it's happening. Now, Matilda's poetry doesn't carry all the way through, right? There's a gap between when she stops writing and when she's killed, but she is able to translate an immense amount of what it must have felt like to live in that part of the world, at that part of history. And it's the same reason we're drawn to someone like Anne Frank, who Richard mentioned, that when someone can write and write beautifully about it, it's a gift, and it makes history more alive than any history book could make it. But I'm curious for what the rest of you think. Harry, Phil, Susan, Kyle, Richard.
I can start. This is Phil. We've, like, as Richard said, we worked on various projects for 25 years at all kinds of different places around the world. And as being part of the science team, certainly we take that scientific approach to it. We use the scientific method. And I must say that of all the different projects I've worked on throughout my whole career, that this project is probably the most satisfying. And it's the most satisfying because And it fits into that concept of the first question that you asked, is using science to write and rewrite history. And when we're in the field, we're collecting data. We worked at the Ponar Forest, which we've mentioned, where 100,000 people were murdered. Our research group worked at Sobibor, where 278,000 Jews were murdered. And when you're out in the field and you're collecting that data, you have it in the back of your mind that you're doing something that's really, really important. And when everything comes together from the perspective of being a scientist, that makes me feel really well. So those two things make me feel very proud. And the fact of when we were driving around looking for the site, we were looking at the memory map and we said, let's just give it a try. And we stretched out the tape and we measured out. And then we had the guys come in and clear the brush and we collected the data. And it was like a perfect storm. Everything came together and it worked out just perfectly. And we did it all in a day and a half. So, like I said, extremely satisfying. And again, like I said, it's kind of, in terms of all the projects I've worked on through many, many years, this is the most satisfying.
Thanks, Phil. Does anyone else want to weigh
Well,
in?
no, but nobody will say it. This is the kind of problem that we face when we're trying to understand the immensity of the Holocaust. Usually it is cast in these 6 million anonymous victims. And I have to say that I find that it's mind-numbing for my students, especially, to conceptualize 6 million. But when you have a person that is their age group, who's living their life. She was a student at Vilnius University, where we worked later in downtown Vilnius. She was a person where her parents were not rich, they were not poor, they were regular. He was a pharmacist, they were regular people. Her poetry is written in Lithuanian, by the way, not written in some dialect of Yiddish that nobody could understand. She felt a part of that country. And the fact that she wasn't murdered by the Nazis, she was murdered by Nazi collaborators in Lithuania. So it's the dilemma that everyone feels about their own identity. And, we're sitting here in a pandemic and we're doing this. We're not going to ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And what I find, for example, having showed this to students, they can grasp this kind of suffering and trauma, and it helps them deal with their own personal suffering and trauma during a pandemic. And it's a way for us to educate people about how you can feel something in the same sense of a known person and not just an anonymous victim.
I mean, I'll piggyback on that. I mean, I agree with both Phil and Richard. I'd also like to say, the community was part of this. The local museum, Deirdris, was out with us every day. He was with the students. He tried to help them understand what was happening local. We went to the museum. There was a ceremony for the individuals who wrote the play, and we were invited to attend that. And then also just some of the local area showing us around, which made all of us feel, okay, this is bigger than just the going to the one site or the multiple sites we took a look around there. And I think when you get invited by local communities, it makes a lot of difference for us. And basically all the projects I've been involved in, with Richard and Phil, are sites that we get invited to. So it's not like saying, we're going to solve your problem. The other way around is that there are sites that need collaboration, and we want to collaborate with those communities.
Great. Thank you guys so much. So I think we're going to open this up to a Q&A from the audience, and we've got a fair amount of questions already. I'll kind of assign them as I go to you guys, and some I might be able to answer myself. Richard, let's start with this. This is actually a good place to start. Eric in the audience is curious why Matilda's story isn't known to a much wider audience like Anne Frank's. What would you say to that?
Well, you should know that there are hundreds of Holocaust diaries, that don't get a lot of attention. The fact that Anne Frank had the right set of editors and people who pushed this in an early period, and because it is so poignant, and because it is a sign of hope, I have to say that a lot of these, having read a lot of these diaries now, and there are people who want us, can you just go to the places where these diaries have been found, and see what's there? Recently, they just found parts of a diary from this guy this rabbi who was at Auschwitz. I mean, we're talking about pieces of a very large puzzle. But unfortunately, people focus on the bigger issues. They focus on these bigger issues. The extermination camps. The one thing that I found very interesting when I asked students about what they knew about the Holocaust, everybody said, we read Anne Frank. And I asked a single question. How did Anne Frank die? He said, I don't know. I have no idea. The one thing they brought out of the Anne Frank story is the idea of hope. Hope. That she was so hopeful. And they didn't even realize she had been turned in by, the family had been turned in by one of the neighbors, and she ended up at Auschwitz. So all these diaries are great pieces of evidence. And if I have to say one thing that is very, very important about why we're doing this, we're losing every day Holocaust survivors. By the time most of these students, I can get them out to the field with me, we may not have Holocaust survivors in another decade. Who will tell this story? So one of the things that I have tried to do in the past decade is to say, science will tell their story. And if there is one little piece to this, if in fact we can show the world that you can never get rid of all the evidence, that no perpetrator of genocide will ever totally get away without leaving evidence behind, that science will find, maybe, just maybe, I'm hopeful that we will deter more genocides. So if there is a larger picture in this whole thing, it is that kind of thing.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate that. And I agree. There've been a couple of questions about how well Matilda's poetry was known when she was alive and before her death. And the answer is that she was published a little bit in her youth and was at least well enough known that magazine editors would call to solicit poems from her. After she died, this is not a matter of her being completely erased from the historical record. Her diary was passed off to a very well-known activist in Vilnius who took care of it. Again, her poetry did appear in, I think I have this right, in a textbook for kids in Lithuania. But the more recent resurrection before Richard and his team got there was in sort of a bringing her up to a wider audience, which the play helped to do in Lithuania. And there were the plans to publish more of her work, which is in both Lithuanian and English, which has been done. So it wasn't, she wasn't totally gone, but it's been a process of bringing her name back. into a wider view. Phil, this is a good question for you. The memory map that you spoke about, can you just tell everybody where, who, the witness that created that memory map, who was she?
Yeah, actually, let's have Richard start off, and then I'll fill in after him because he has the more information about who she was, etc.
Well, first of all, I just want to make sure this was published in 1990. And what was very good is when we got there, it was one of the first things they showed us. They said, you know, there is this memory map. Now, I want to make sure that everybody understands what a memory map is. It is someone who was either there or is a firsthand or sometimes a secondhand. And what they do is they present their memory of what was seen, and then they later have somebody draw it. So that memory map was not drawn by the person who actually saw the event. It was prepared for a newspaper, and what was very good is the newspaper published this map, and it was something that people locally knew about. So when we have something like that, we don't take it literally, but we take it seriously. Because we have to be able to say that if somebody was a firsthand witness and the editor of the newspaper decided to publish it, they had their own fact checking in that time period. So this was an unusual circumstance. Sometimes we have memory maps, like we had a memory map from a nearby village where we went and visited. And what's very interesting is the memory map was so specific. It was done in the 30s by somebody who came back to Philadelphia. And the memory map included details of where the rabbi's house was, where so-and-so's house was, where the bathhouse was, where every single part of the business is there. So memory maps can be very, very good. In the case of trying to find, and I have to say this out loud, so everybody is not, we rarely accept a proposal to try to find one person or a small group of people. Unfortunately, we have been involved in large mass graves, mass murders, and trying to identify where they are. And there's somebody who's going to ask it, because I've seen it come up already. How do you know there's a burial there? How do you know it's just some kind of, they buried animals there. They buried other things there. First of all, we do not know 100% that it is a burial for human beings. But we have a chemical test now, a phosphate test, that we do of the roots of the grass that allows us to actually be able to analyze whether there is below the surface burials. We've used it at Fort 9. We've used it at other sites, because one of the things that we do, especially for a mass grave, if we're going to identify this as a mass grave, even when we have the anomalies, even when we have the eyewitnesses, we want to make sure that this area is not built on again. And so what we try to provide is as much evidence that science can muster, short of digging up the people. So.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit more to that. Again, as I said, you always are looking for all these different pieces of information that you can pull together, whatever exists, be it a map, an aerial photograph, a memory map. And then, like Richard said, you have to take a memory map with a grain of salt because it's someone's memory. And if you have corroborating information, that adds strength to what you're trying to accomplish. And we had the 1944 Luftwaffe photographs. We had the memory map. We have the ability to make those overlays like I showed you. And having the memory map alone is one piece of evidence, but being able to plot that on the 1944 Luftwaffe photograph gives us another piece of evidence. And then going out into the field and then actually looking at that location And what Harry pointed out, there's kind of a circular depression there. Couldn't see that unless our Lithuanian friends cleared the brush out of there. And there was a visual anomaly as well. So then we have another piece of evidence. So the memory map becomes part of it. You don't necessarily have to have a memory map to be able to find certain locations, but it all helps. It all gets put together, and it's like putting a puzzle together. There was another site that we worked at near there named Truckus. And basically we did the same thing. Someone had some second, third, fourth hand information that there may have been a mass burial in this one particular location. So we went in, we looked for visual anomalies, we took the equipment in, we did ground penetrating radar, and lo and behold, we found an anomaly that would indicate that a large hole was dug there, and then the material was filled back in again. Richard, how many people are expected to be at Truckus in that burial?
I think in the 30s, 30 plus people. So again, when we get this information about a mass grave, we were going to be in the area, so we decided we would do that area as well. But again, when we go to a site, we need to have as much information as possible. People are asking me, so how do you choose? It's when we have enough information that we think that we're able to do something. If we don't feel we can do something, it's really not for us to take all the equipment and try to find something that people don't have information on. So all these pieces need to have at least one or two backups. And then we have to have, which is very important, we have to have local people. We need to have local support from the municipality. The mayor of the municipality of Rokiškis was very, very supportive. The places where we stayed, the people who took us around, the people who cut down the trees. By the way, I had to get a permit to cut down the trees. So being able to get those people to work on your behalf and not say, oh, come back in another 2 months, come back in a week. We come to a site. If we have the cooperation of a local municipality, we can do tremendous things. But it really takes to have a whole group of people and a whole bunch of supporting materials in order to get one site done.
Right, and if you recall, Richard, when they came out, the lady from the municipality in her dress and high heels came out and walked out into the field and told the guys, because she had to translate for us into Lithuanian, this is where we want you to cut down, and cut them as close to the ground as you can and clear out as much brush as you can.
Right.
Thanks, guys. A few quick questions that I can answer really quickly. Someone just asked if this is the same team behind the escape tunnel documentary on PBS, and it is from a few years earlier, which is how I met these guys. I'd gone out to report on their work there. Susan, here's a question for you, and for you, Kyle. What are the challenges in translating this kind of material and bringing it to life on film for an audience in the U.S.?
Well, the challenges for translation, we did a lot of interviews that actually were in Lithuanian. And we had someone there that was talking to them and asking the questions. But once we got here, we were really unable to try to get all of that, especially, like I said, with our time frame and our funding, we were not able to get it translated, nor would it have fit in what we ended up doing. We were trying to, what Kyle and I talked about, we have many iterations of this documentary, but we knew we wanted to keep it short because it was by college students, about a college student, for college students. And as you know, with social media, college students don't like anything that goes past, let's say 3 minutes. But we knew it had to be a little longer than that. So we were trying to keep it very tight. If you watch the film, it cuts a lot. We used historical footage as well, because that was part of the class as well. So the challenges came in many areas, but we also knew we wanted it something that college students can look at and identify with. So Kyle, I'll let you jump on from there.
Yeah, I think I mean, everything is true about what you said. It was also hard trying to find people who could translate in Lithuanian in that time frame that we had also. So that was a major, like hour-long interviews translated is just a massive project, and probably no one would have really have done it for free. So we would have had another challenge there with the money wise, but it was just through money. And I mean, it's since it's through a college, we were on funding and time. So, but
I also just want the audience to really put in perspective that this was a college class experience. So it was me teaching students how to film something, and then the students in the field, Harry's students, were also learning something. So the story, we couldn't get too in depth story wise because we were also being teachers at the moment, and they were being students. So that has to also be part of the perspective of the whole experience. Then coming home and editing it, like I said, Kyle and I, my God, we must have 6 scripts going on at different times about, okay, if we got this, then we'll use that. And if we got that, we'll use that. But this is what we ended up in the end being able to actually accomplish.
And Susan, I want to tell you one thing. I had one colleague who shall be nameless, who, when we came back and we were all very excited when we came back because we knew that we had captured a really important story. So one of my colleagues, who shall be nameless, came up to me and says, you know, you take these students into the field and you're out there and you're doing that. When do you find time for teaching? I was like shocked. I said, there's not a moment from the time that students get up in the morning and have coffee with us to the time that Harry Joel is sitting there drinking tea in the afternoon, to the time when they go to sleep at night. There is not a moment that we are not teaching. And that is what makes it a powerful experience for students. And, you know, I have to say, I dragged you into it, Susan. I feel bad because here you knew nothing about this whole thing. We have been doing this for many years, and we were so happy that there was a person like yourself who was willing to go to the field and endure conditions. And I have to say, most of these people knew very little about the Holocaust. They knew very little about geoscience. They knew very little about archaeology, but everybody was so willing to learn. And that is what made it such a special moment. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
We have time for just a couple more here, but there have been a couple questions about the memorial, and I'll let Richard clarify this. The memorial predates the discovery, the work that Richard and his team did, and there are actually 2 memorials. There's a kind of totem that's in a beautifully wood carved totem that's in the little downtown area of this village. And there was a second memorial, and this was closer to the graves, and these were all created by local people and based on donations. I believe, Richard, you'll have to correct me, but some of that was funded in part by people who saw the play, right? And
I have to say that because nobody asked it, but I think I should volunteer it. People always ask me, what is your impression of the Lithuanians in their ability to grasp the fact that the Jewish population of Lithuania, 95% of them were wiped out. And I have to say, I've worked in Poland, I've worked in Greece, I worked in other places where the Holocaust is extremely, extremely prominent. And the Lithuanians are able to find a way to integrate this into Lithuanian history, their own local history, their own regional history, and they can understand the significance. In the case of Matilda, Naringa, who did this wonderful play that won awards in Lithuania, that this group of people who were a part of the play put together the money to make sure that this very specific monument, stone monument, was at the road. And I'll tell you how moved we all were by spending time with the students after we had finished the work, standing around that memorial and having the moment where the students can see that Lithuanians care about their history. It's not something that it's just Jewish history. This is Lithuanian history. And to have Lithuanians involved in that. But I have to tell you the other part, the totem pole, the wood totem pole, which was carved by a local carver, very famous local carver we actually met by the church. And what's interesting about the totem pole is that people actually gather, young women, men, they gather around this totem pole for events. And it's in the middle of the small village, and it has created a way for them to not grieve, but to understand what's been lost. What's been lost. And that to me is not only teaching students, it's allowing communities to be able to deal with the pain and suffering in a way that is uniquely Lithuanian. And they can, I think, find in this one person's life and work something that's meaningful to them, even today. And that on a good day for a person who teaches in a small liberal arts college, this is something where you feel like you're making a difference.
Thanks so much, Richard. We're gonna have time for only a couple more here, but this one just popped up and I'm kind of interested in it. I think this is you, Phil. The second blip in the 1944 aerial photograph. Did you go and look?
No, because we couldn't see it on the resolution of a laptop when we would bring those photos up. And I did not recognize that it was even there until I got back and had it up on my big computer monitor and such. So yeah, the next time we're in the Rokiskis area, we're certainly going to go up on that hill and see what's there and probably collect some ground penetrating radar data as well. Because if you can look at it, on a good monitor, the anomalies visually look very, very similar to each other. Like I said, the next time we're in the Rokiskis area, we're going to certainly have a look at it.
Great. Richard, this is an interesting question for you, talking about how you're using science to bring all of this to life. Have you ever had a conversation or have you ever been able to gauge the impact on people who deny or minimize the Holocaust? That you have here is, real substantial scientific proof that this occurred in this place. Do you think about that when you're doing this research, that this is also, I don't know how much more proof people need, but that this is bringing it home to people in a certain way?
Before we started with geoscience on Holocaust archaeology, there was Holocaust archaeology being done. And Holocaust archaeologists, period, and speaking, places that they went to, they dug people up. They dug them up because that's the way they did archaeology in that time period. And Holocaust deniers will never have enough data to tell them that this happened. So science has to do good science. And with the good science, we want to make sure that people who use science, that they have science to do this. But I'll tell you what is very worrisome is before, I always had a Holocaust survivor that I could call for advice. We found, for example, a bunch of keys. We couldn't figure out what these small, tiny keys were. And I called up a survivor. We've excavated this area near this building, and we found all these little small keys. And she says, "You don't know what that is?" I said, "We can't figure it out. Why are there so many keys here?" People, when they came in on the train, left their belongings in suitcases that they locked. They thought they were going to come back to retrieve them. And naked, they walked to the gas chambers. And when they got there, they could see what was happening. And they didn't want to make it easy for the Nazis, so they buried their keys. And you know, that little piece of information from a Holocaust survivor gave us a whole perspective on what is the value of looking at these testimonies. And you should know there are 50,000 at the Spielberg Center in California, and there's another 5,000 to 8,000 in the Boston area and Yale as the Fortunoff collection. These stories contain important pieces of information that science can now take from those live interviews and then create an understanding which I think makes a difference for this generation of students. They want to see the evidence.
This is the last question before we have to end. Richard, can you tell us what your plans are for the next year or so?
Oh, well,
Pandemic.
COVID upset our plans for last summer. We were supposed to go in 2020, 4 countries. We're doing a full-length documentary on what's called the Resistance Project. We started to notice all these different sites that we had worked at. We worked in Warsaw by the famous Mila 18 bunker. We worked in Fort 9, where the escape from Fort 9 on Christmas Day showed the type of fortitude. We had the escape tunnel in Ponar. We started to see all these different pieces, and we were being asked to come back and to put them all together into one piece. So the next project, 4 countries, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, is what we're going to do this summer. COVID to the side. And we're going to be able to, I think, put together a story from the way that resistance was done by the Jews. The Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter. The Jews resisted in all these different ways, that literary ways and cultural ways and spiritual ways and armed and unarmed escapes. So part of this is to be able to tell it in one place, because this story of Jewish resistance is really what will keep people inspired by the stories of the Holocaust.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys, everyone.
Thanks, Matt.
Who has participated. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. And Kristen, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Wow. A big thank you to all of the panelists for engaging in such an incredibly moving presentation tonight. We're grateful for your sincere efforts in preserving history. And thank you all in the audience for joining us today and for asking great questions. At the Vilna, we are dedicated to preserving history and inspiring cultural and spiritual connections to perpetuate an enduring Jewish identity and create a vibrant future. To fully fund our mission, we rely on the philanthropic support of people like you. To learn more about how your gift would truly make a difference, please visit our website, vilnashul.org. We also invite you to visit our website and register for the upcoming April 11th program titled Tales from the Lagoon. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you.